Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. And today we're really going to kind of get into how sports can be more than just physical for young athletes.
Yeah.
We always talk about the benefits of physical activity and all
Mhm.
that, but we don't always think about the mental side of things.
Yeah,
So we're going to get into that today, and this is really important for parents and coaches to listen to.
absolutely.
Because you're the ones who are really guiding these young
For
athletes
sure.
and shaping their experiences.
Absolutely. And I think, it's something that we often overlook.
Yeah.
And I think today we're going to be looking at a chapter from Mind Over Muscle, Unleashing the Hidden Power of Young Athletes.
Yeah, that's a great book.
And it's a great resource for anyone who's working with young people in sports.
And it's really cool because it uses stories of young athletes to kind of get these points across.
Exactly.
It's not just like, here's the theory. It's
Right.
like, here's how it actually plays out.
Yeah. And it makes it much more relatable,
Yeah.
much more engaging.
So one of the first things that this book tackles is this idea that sports are just about physical talent.
Right.
You hear that all the time, like, oh, he's a natural athlete, or
Right.
she's just
gifted.
yeah, she's just gifted.
Right.
But this book says, no, 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 it's actually a lot more than that.
Yeah.
And it really dives into how participating in sports can actually make kids sharper thinkers.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I really liked about the book is how it brought in the research to support those claims.
Yeah.
So it's not just anecdotal evidence. It's
Mhm.
like there are studies that show that, kids who play sports show improvements in decision making,
Mhm.
strategic thinking, and, even their ability to just kind of size up situations,
Yeah.
which are valuable skills beyond the field.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, it's not just about, being a better athlete. It's
Yeah.
about being a, better
Apex.
person.
Yeah.
Yeah. More equipped for life.
And they give a great example of this with this young soccer player named Pearl.
Yeah.
And she's 12 years old, and she's in this soccer game, and it's tied,
Oh,
and the clock's running out.
yeah.
Pressure's on.
Big time.
Right.
Big time.
And she remembers her coach's advice,
Mm-hmm.
to just read the game.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden she has this like flash of insight, and she makes this incredible strategic move
Wow.
and scores the winning goal.
Amazing.
Right. And it's just this perfect example of how sports can push kids to think on their feet
Yeah.
and make decisions under pressure.
Yeah. And that's a great example of what happens when those cognitive skills, really start to kick in.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about it like, as young athletes grow, they move beyond just reacting instinctively.
Yeah.
They actually start to analyze their experiences, and that leads to, a much deeper understanding of the sport,
Yeah.
of themselves.
It's like they're not just playing. They're thinking about the play.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. And that's when you really start to see those cognitive benefits,
Yeah.
start to,
Really blossom.
yeah.
Blossom.
Yeah.
So for all the parents and coaches out there,
Yeah.
how can we encourage this kind of growth?
I think that's a great question.
Right, because it's not just about, cheering them on during the game.
Right.
It's about,
It's about more than that.
yeah, it's about more than that.
Yeah.
So what can we do?
Well, one of the things that I thought was really interesting in the book was how they talked about, anticipating game time scenarios during practice.
Oh, yeah.
So, rather than just, going through the motions, having them actually think about
Right. Yeah.
what if questions. Like what if the other team double teams you?
Mm-hmm.
What are your options then?
Right.
And that kind of thinking, it helps them to strategize in advance.
That's like giving them a mental playbook.
Exactly.
Right.
So that when they're in those pressure situations, they've already thought about it.
They're not caught off guard.
Right. They're not caught off guard. Exactly.
Okay, now let's talk about emotions.
Yeah.
We all know competitive sports can be a roller coaster.
Absolutely.
There's highs, there's lows,
Yeah.
there's, all the feelings.
All of it.
So how can we help young athletes manage those intense feelings?
Well, the book really emphasizes this idea of emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
And it's not just about, being nice or being friendly.
Right.
It's about being able to recognize, understand, and manage your own emotions.
Yeah.
And even the emotions of others.
And how do sports actually help with that?
Well, there's some really fascinating research on this.
Yeah.
There was a study by the University of California, Los Angeles,
Yep.
that actually found that athletes who participate in mindfulness training
Uh-huh.
which focuses on being present and aware of your thoughts and feelings,
Mm.
they saw a 20% improvement in their ability to manage stress during competition.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's really incredible.
So it seems like these skills could really benefit kids on and off the field.
Absolutely. Not just, when they're in the game, but also in school and their personal lives.
Right.
Across the court.
In relationships with family and friends.
Exactly.
And the book uses another story here to kind of bring this to life. And they talk about Luca,
Yeah.
who's a high school swimmer.
Okay.
And he was absolutely devastated when he didn't qualify for the finals
Oh, I can imagine.
at a big championship meet.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, that's got to be just crushing.
Heartbreaking.
So what happened next?
Well, here's the turning point.
Okay.
Luca, with the guidance of his coach, chose to really analyze his performance
Okay.
rather than just wallowing in disappointment.
Mm-hmm.
He shifted his focus from feeling like a failure
Yeah.
to identifying areas where he could improve.
Yeah.
And that's a really powerful shift
It is. Yeah.
because it's about teaching young athletes to view setbacks as opportunities for growth.
Yeah. I love that.
Right.
So instead of seeing it as like the end, it's
Yeah.
like, okay,
It's a
well,
new beginning.
yeah, what can I learn from this?
Right.
How can I get better?
Exactly. And Luca's coach, also introduced him to some practical tools for dealing with those pre-competition jitters. Things like visualization techniques
Okay.
and breathing exercises
Yeah.
to help manage anxiety.
So it's like giving them a toolkit to handle those big feelings.
Exactly. And these are skills that, again, can benefit any young athlete, not just those who are, facing those high-stakes competitions.
Right. It's everyday life.
It's everyday life, exactly.
So for our listeners out there,
Yeah.
the parents, the coaches, it's about encouraging kids to talk about their feelings,
Right.
teaching them these coping mechanisms,
Absolutely.
and celebrating their efforts, even when they don't get the gold medal,
Yes.
right?
That's so important.
Because it's about supporting their emotional development just as much as we support their physical development.
Right.
Okay, now let's shift gears a bit here
Okay.
and talk about something that's often overlooked, I think.
Yeah.
And that is how sports can actually shape a young person's identity.
Yeah.
We often think of sports as building character,
Mhm.
but it goes even deeper than that.
It does. It does.
Right.
Because success in sports can be such a huge source of validation for young people.
Right.
But it's important for them to develop a sense of self that isn't solely based on their athletic achievement.
And the book explores this dynamic through the story of Stephen,
Uh-huh.
who was a gifted runner.
Okay.
And his self-worth was totally tied to winning.
Okay.
He was all about being the best.
Mm-hmm.
And then when injuries forced him to take a break,
Uh-oh.
he had to confront this really tough question.
Yeah.
Who am I
Yeah.
if I'm not a top runner?
Right.
And that's a question that a lot of young athletes struggle with.
I think so.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, they define themselves by their sport,
Right.
by, their position on the team, by their stats.
Right.
And when that's taken away, it can be really unsettling.
So how do we help young athletes navigate this?
Well, I think open and honest communication is key,
Yeah.
between athletes, coaches, and families.
Yeah.
It's about helping young people develop a balanced sense of self,
Mm-hmm.
where they recognize their value beyond their athletic performance.
It's understanding that their worth isn't tied to a scoreboard.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about who they are as human beings.
Yeah. And that's such an important message.
Absolutely.
Okay, now let's shift our focus again
Okay.
to the fascinating evolution of motivation in young athletes.
Yeah.
You mean like how their drive can change as they grow and mature?
Exactly.
Right.
So, younger athletes are often driven by external factors,
Okay.
things like praise from coaches,
Yeah.
recognition from their peers, and of course, winning. But as they get older, something really interesting happens.
Okay.
They start to develop that inner drive.
That love for the sport itself.
You got it.
Right.
The joy starts to come from the challenge,
Okay.
from the feeling of mastering a skill,
Right.
from the camaraderie of the team.
Yeah.
That internal motivation becomes a much more powerful force.
And the book uses the story of Iris,
Okay.
who's a gymnast,
Okay.
to illustrate this.
Okay.
And in the beginning, she was all about the scores and the applause,
Mhm.
those external markers of success.
Right.
But her coach wisely helped her shift her focus.
Good for her.
And they started setting goals that were more about personal growth
Yeah.
and developing her skills
Mm.
rather than just winning.
Love it.
And guess what happened?
I bet her motivation went through the roof.
You nailed it.
Right.
Setbacks became opportunities for learning,
Yeah.
and her passion for gymnastics deepened.
That's awesome.
She found joy in the process, not just the outcome.
That's the key.
Right. That's what we want.
And this is such a crucial lesson
Yeah.
for anyone working with young athletes.
Right.
You know, we need to think about how we can foster that intrinsic motivation.
Absolutely.
How do we help kids find joy in the journey,
Yeah.
not just the destination?
That's a great question, and one we'll continue to explore
Yeah.
as we delve deeper into this topic.
So to quickly recap what we've covered so far,
Mm-hmm.
it's clear that youth sports are so much more than just physical activity.
Absolutely.
They can be a powerful training ground
Yeah.
for building cognitive skills,
Mhm.
developing emotional intelligence,
Yeah.
shaping identity,
Hmm.
and even evolving motivation.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It is.
How much more there is to it.
Yeah, it really is. And in the next part of our deep dive, we'll continue to unpack these interconnected threads,
Yeah.
examining the profound impact sports can have on the lives of young people. So stay tuned.
Dude.
Wow. It's amazing, isn't it, how these stories that we're getting from Mind Over Muscle, yeah,
Really show how much more there is to youth sports than
Yeah.
meets the eye, right?
Yeah.
It's not just about the
Yeah.
physical stuff.
right.
There are so many layers to how kids develop mentally and emotionally through these experiences.
And you know, one thing that I found really fascinating about the book is how it challenges that one-size-fits-all notion of how kids develop those thinking skills.
Mm-hmm.
In sports, it highlights, you know, how individual maturity levels, training methods,
Right.
and even environmental influences come into play.
It's different for everybody.
Yeah, it's not a linear path.
Right. And,
Right.
and also, we were talking about that intrinsic motivation, that inner
Yeah.
drive.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like that plays a huge role in how athletes approach those challenges and develop their cognitive skills.
Absolutely. And you know, going back to Pearl, our star soccer player,
Yeah.
her story really illustrates, you know, how those cognitive skills can evolve over time.
Oh, yeah. Pearl scoring that winning goal under pressure.
Yep. Exactly. So, you know, younger athletes like Pearl might initially rely more on instinct and, you know, natural talent.
Right.
But as they gain experience and mature,
Mm.
they start incorporating more reflective practices into their game.
Okay.
And that's where they really deepen their understanding of the sport.
I was like they become students of the game.
Yes.
Right.
They start analyzing strategies, they start anticipating their opponent's moves, and they make decisions based on this much deeper level of understanding.
It's not just reacting anymore.
Exactly.
They're actually thinking about it.
Yeah, and this is where coaches can really have a profound impact.
Yeah.
They can create training environments
Mhm.
that nurture those mental skills, you know,
Uh-huh.
challenge athletes to think strategically and make those connections between their physical actions and the results on the field.
So instead of just drilling plays over and over,
Right.
right? Coaches can encourage them to think critically and solve problems on the fly.
Imagine a basketball coach who, instead of just, you know, running through set plays, presents a hypothetical game situation
Oh, I like that.
and says, all right, team, the score is tied. There are 10 seconds left on the clock.
Yeah.
What's our play?
What do we do?
What do we do? You know, get those mental wheels turning.
That's great.
Right.
It's turning practice into a mental workout as much as a physical one.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's not just about building muscle memory.
Right.
It's building those critical thinking skills.
Absolutely.
Okay, now let's dive back into the emotional side of things.
Okay.
It's clear that emotional intelligence is a game changer for young athletes,
Mm-hmm.
especially when the competition heats up.
Absolutely. And Mind Over Muscle does a great job of, you know, highlighting that.
Mm.
It reminds us that emotional intelligence isn't just about, you know, managing stress or anxiety.
Right.
It's also about developing empathy, self-awareness, and building strong connections with others.
Yeah.
These are life skills,
Yeah.
not just sports skills.
Right. And think about Luca, again, our swimmer, who didn't make the finals.
Yeah.
He didn't just learn to handle his disappointment.
Right.
He also developed a deeper understanding of his own emotional patterns, right?
Yeah.
And he even used that experience to connect with and support his teammates who were also struggling.
I love that.
Right.
His story really shows that emotional intelligence can transform these challenging situations
Yeah.
into opportunities for growth
Mm.
and connection.
Right. It's not about suppressing those negative emotions.
Right.
Right. It's about learning to process them in a healthy and productive way.
And, we talked about those practical tools
Yeah.
for navigating the emotional roller coaster
Yeah, like what?
of competition. Things like visualization techniques and breathing exercises.
Yeah. Yeah.
To manage those pregame jitters and mind over muscle, actually give some specific examples.
Okay.
One technique that they highlight is called progressive muscle relaxation. And it involves tensing and releasing different muscle groups in the body,
I've heard of that.
which can help athletes release that physical tension and calm their nerves.
That's a good one.
And then there's also the box breathing technique, where you inhale for a count of 4, hold your breath for 4, exhale for 4, and hold again for 4.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a really simple but powerful way to regulate your breathing and calm your mind.
And the great thing is you can do those things anytime.
Anywhere, anytime, exactly.
Right.
So parents and coaches can really help young athletes develop these skills by introducing them and encouraging regular practice.
It's like giving them a set of tools for life.
Yes.
Right? They can use these techniques to handle those pre-test jitters, deal with social anxiety, or just navigate any stressful situation that they might encounter.
It's a great foundation.
Yeah. So now, ready to explore another fascinating aspect of youth sports.
I am. What do you got?
Okay, let's delve into the world of identity formation.
Okay.
And how participation in sports can shape a young person's sense of self.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Right? This is something that we touched on earlier.
We did with Steven.
With Steven the runner, who had to redefine himself after his injuries.
Right, and it's a theme that runs throughout Mind Over Muscle.
Yeah.
It really highlights the importance of encouraging young athletes to develop a multifaceted sense of self, one that isn't solely defined by their athletic accomplishments.
It's about recognizing that there's so much more than just athletes.
Exactly.
Right.
They are individuals with unique talents, interests, passions
Yeah.
that extend far beyond the playing field.
And that's where parents and coaches come in.
Yes.
We can encourage them to explore those other interests, whether it's music, art, academics, community service, anything that sparks their curiosity.
Exactly.
Right? It's about providing opportunities for them to shine in different arenas, to discover their passions and develop this more well-rounded and resilient sense of self.
That's the goal.
Right.
And that's something that we're going to continue to explore as we move into the final part of our deep dive.
So stay tuned.
Stay tuned.
We've got more fascinating insights to uncover. Welcome back to our deep dive. Really getting into some interesting stuff with this Mind Over Muscle book.
Yeah. It's been great, hasn't it?
Yeah. And, especially for those of you working closely with young athletes, I mean, this is gold.
Yeah. It's been really neat to see how those stories that we've been discussing, Pearl Luca, Stephen Iris, really weave together, the physical and psychological aspects of sports. And they really showcase how profoundly, sports can impact a young person's development, far beyond just the physical skills.
Yeah. It's like sports become this incredible training ground for life.
Yes.
Equipping these young athletes with tools and insights that they can carry with them.
Yeah.
Way beyond the playing field.
Absolutely. And speaking of training grounds, let's revisit that discussion about, creating environments that stimulate those mental muscles.
Yeah.
Mind over muscle really emphasizes this point.
Yeah. You mean like fostering environment that encourage strategic thinking, problem solving?
Yes.
Deeper understanding of their sport?
Exactly.
It's like we were saying earlier, turning practice into a mental puzzle.
Precisely. And coaches can really be architects of these environments.
Okay.
They can design practices that challenge those athletes to think critically, to make decisions on the fly, and to truly analyze their own performance. It's more than just running drills. It's about engaging their minds as much as their bodies.
And I love that idea of, presenting them with those hypothetical game scenarios. Like, okay, what would you do if the score was tied with seconds left on the clock?
Right, exactly.
It really forces them to think strategically.
It does.
And come up with solutions.
And think about, a soccer coach, for example, who, divides the team up and asks each group to analyze the other team's weaknesses and then come up with a plan to exploit those.
Right.
That kind of activity helps young athletes, become more aware of the nuances of the game and develop their strategic thinking skills.
Yeah, it's about nurturing those problem solvers, those critical thinkers.
Yes.
Who can adapt to different situations.
Absolutely.
Okay, now shifting back to the emotional side of things, Mind Over Muscle really highlights that transformative power of emotional intelligence,
It does.
especially for young athletes facing those pressures of competition.
And remember we said before, emotional intelligence isn't just about handling stress and anxiety.
Right.
It's about, developing empathy, self-awareness, and the ability to connect with others on a deeper level.
Yeah.
These are skills that benefit them in every aspect of life.
Right, not just in sports.
Not just in sports.
It's about recognizing and understanding their own emotions, but also understanding the emotions of those around them,
Yes.
like their teammates, their coaches, even their opponents.
Exactly. It's about creating that space for open and honest conversation
Yeah.
about feelings.
And building a culture of support where those young athletes feel comfortable expressing their vulnerabilities,
Right.
right, without fear of judgment.
Exactly.
So for all of you parents and coaches listening out there, how can you actively help the young athletes in your life build this emotional intelligence?
Well, we've talked about some specific techniques.
Yeah.
Things like progressive muscle relaxation and box breathing.
Right.
But beyond those techniques, it's about, consistently encouraging them to talk about their feelings,
Yeah.
both positive and negative.
And teaching them healthy coping mechanisms.
Absolutely.
Right, for when those difficult emotions arise.
Yeah, introduce them to mindfulness practices, journaling,
Sure.
or even just, talking things through with a trusted adult.
Right. It's about building that emotional toolkit
Exactly.
that they can draw on
Yes.
whenever they need it.
And remember to celebrate their efforts,
Yes.
their resilience, their sportsmanship,
Yes.
not just their victories.
Right. Let them know that their worth as individuals
Yeah.
goes far beyond
Yes.
what they achieve in their sport.
100%.
Okay. Now, before we wrap up, let's revisit that discussion about identity formation
Yeah.
and how being involved in sports can shape a young person's sense of self.
Yeah. Mind over muscle really dives deep into this one.
Yeah.
It's so important to remember that sports can be an amazing platform for self-discovery.
Right.
They can build confidence, instill discipline, and foster a sense of belonging.
Right.
But it's crucial to make sure that, young athletes don't solely define themselves by their athletic achievements.
Like we saw with Steven, our runner.
Exactly. It took a series of injuries for him to realize that, he was more than just his running time.
Right. So how do we help other young athletes avoid that trap?
Encourage them to explore their interests
Yeah.
beyond sports.
Right.
Support their passions.
Yeah.
Whether it's music, art, academics, volunteering, anything that helps them, develop a well-rounded identity.
It's about showing them that they can shine in multiple areas of life
Yes.
and that their athletic identity is just one piece of the puzzle.
And don't forget about fostering that open communication we talked about.
Right.
Create that safe space where they can talk about their doubts, their fears, their aspirations.
Yeah.
Let them know that you love and value them
Yeah.
for who they are, not just for, how well they perform on the field.
And finally, let's revisit that concept of how motivation evolves in young athletes.
Yeah, mind over muscle. Did a great job illustrating this.
Remember, those early stages are often driven by those external rewards.
Right, the trophies, the praise, the recognition.
Right. But as they grow and mature, we want to guide them towards that intrinsic motivation.
Yes.
That pure love for the sport itself.
Like we saw with Iris, the gymnast. Once she shifted her focus from those external rewards to her own personal growth and enjoyment of the sport, her motivation and passion just skyrocketed.
So what can we do as parents and coaches to nurture that inner drive, that love for the game?
Mind over muscle, suggests emphasizing, the fundamentals of the sport.
Yeah.
And the pure joy of movement. Let's celebrate their progress.
Yeah.
No matter how small, and help them set realistic goals
Yeah.
that are focused on skill development and personal growth, not just winning.
Right. And above all, let's create that positive and supportive environment where they feel safe to take risks,
Yes.
make mistakes, and learn from those experiences.
That's about fostering that love for the journey, not just the destination.
That's a beautiful way to put it. So as we wrap up this deep dive into mind over muscle and the psychology of young athletes, we want to leave you with this thought-provoking question.
Okay, hit me.
What stories are you seeing unfold in the young athletes that you work with? And how can you help them write the most empowering chapters in their own unique sports journeys?
Because ultimately, it's about empowering these amazing young people to not only excel in their chosen sports, but to thrive in all aspects of their lives.
That's it. Thanks for joining us on this journey. Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those stories coming.